Hey, this is Distilled the Bourbon podcast. We are at Spirits of French Lick. We're actually in one of the still houses. This is H3, and we are with head alchemist and historian here at Spirits of French Lick, Alan Bishop.
Yeah, excellent to be here, guys. Thanks for having me. Well, I mean, we're here where I work, but thanks for coming here to have me here.
So, we're in a working distillery. It's noisy in here. You're probably going to hear some background hums. You're going to hear other things. We'll try to keep it down to a minimum. But this is such a cool place. We've got pot stills over on one side. We've got column stills. We've got blending vents. There's some distinctive barrels back there that have some significance. But Alan Bishop is one of the most innovative distillers in the business, I think. This is a small, this is a craft distillery.
Yep.
But the range of products that you all have here, you've got bourbon, you've got clear whiskeys, you've got aquavit, you've got absinthe, you've got vodka, you've got gin. It's just apple brandy. When I was here in December, I got to have a sample of 145 proof apple brandy. 145.3. 145.3. And what is it about the 0.3?
It's a 0.3 that does you.
There you go.
Build 145, it's a 0.3. You start thinking.
It gets in your head.
Yeah, exactly.
So at 145 proof, it was so smooth. It is just dangerous. But I really admire Alan's ambition and he's not afraid to try anything. So what I'd like to hear is tell us about your beginnings in distilling.
Yeah, so I grew up in a family of distillers. My family is on both sides from Kentucky. Not that you have to be from Kentucky to be a distiller, obviously, especially if we talk about the history of distilling in Indiana, which we can later on. But my mom's side and my dad's side were both involved in moonshine to some degree. My mom's side of the family, and I very rarely talk about this, but she had a great uncle who worked for national distillers. He wasn't a distiller, but he was a mash man, and he did that for a few years and kind of disappeared back out into the hollows around Oneida, Kentucky, and became a preacher and distiller in Oneida, Kentucky. And I don't think he ever really left the hollow. He lived in again for the next 30 years, from what I understand.
What county is it?
So that would be in Clay County.
Okay.
So my mom's family's from there. My dad's family, they're all from Greene and Hart County, so Greensburg, Kentucky. So I was around stills. I remember being around still when I was 3 or 4 years old. It's one of my very first memories, legitimately, of seeing that. And it's for me then, there wasn't anything romantic about it. Like we raised tobacco and we made a little bit of moonshine on the side. That's how we paid for our property taxes and we paid for Christmas. And to me, it was like another piece of farm equipment, and it was a reason why we can't go do anything fun this weekend. Because you had to work, right. Yeah, right. And mom and dad, they both worked at Kimmel's, through the week, and then the weekends we're doing tobacco or there's moonshining going on. So that's kind of where I started. And as a kid, I wasn't really interested in it. I helped and I did things. We did a lot of brandies because everybody had an apple tree or two in the yard or a peach tree or two. And if they made anything from it, they'd make a pie or two, and the rest would go to waste. I didn't want to have to mow around that stuff like yellow jackets in the morning. So just ask my neighbors if they have apples on their property, and they're more than happy to let you go pick them up and do something with them. So when I was about 15, I got a little more tangentially interested in distilling for obvious reasons. I either had the best mom and dad in the world or the worst mom and dad in the world, because they would let me do things, but it had to happen at the house under sort of a safe as what you can be with my parents, I guess. Sort of a safe environment to do those things, and the rules were literally a little 10-gallon still out of a once used or out of a stainless steel coffee dispenser from Fort Knox. And the rules were don't blow yourself up in the backyard and bring us something once we're drinking. But they wouldn't tell me how to do anything. I knew the things I saw them do, right? Because I've been around it, I helped them with it. But when it came to time for me to kind of get into that and figure out how to do my own things, I thought, well, I've never seen them use oats in a mash bill, right? Let's throw oats in there; they're great. Let's see what happens. Of course, there's a history of oats in distillation, anyways.
You knew that history.
I didn't know any of that stuff. Yeah, exactly. So I stumbled into it. And then in my mid-20s, I converted the old tobacco farm into a produce farm, organic produce, really. And what my real passion was in plant breeding and in saving seeds and selling seeds. It's kind of a hard way to make money. So you kind of get into distilling on the side. Whiskey and brandy are kind of a value-added product in the farmer's market as long as you don't get caught with it. So I kind of went down that road and went, I've got all these strange things I'm growing. What happens if you put them to distill. Distilling is inherently agricultural, and it's always tied to agriculture. So now I've got this odd variety of corn that I can't sell otherwise. Let's put it through distill and see what happens. And that ended up leading to building a 150-gallon pot still one time. And my wife now, it was my girlfriend at the time, she's like, you got to go get a job doing this. So
where did that lead?
That led to Copper Kings. And really, it started off as it would have led to whoever would have been kind enough and or dumb enough to hire, one way or the other. So we got somebody to pivot to my side right now. That's what you're hearing in the background. There's an ice machine outside.
So this is a working distillery.
Absolutely. So basically, at the time, Indiana there were only just a couple of legal distilleries in Indiana, really Hubers and MGP. And they were just now starting to sort of talk about the craft distilling law and what they were able to do with that and was able to get involved in it. So I basically wrote the worst resume that anyone's ever seen in their life. Probably still have it somewhere. I thought I was being clever. I thought, I'll run some moonshine off and whenever I get an interview, okay, they don't care. It doesn't matter. But I literally turned in applications. I looked up every distillery that was opening in northern Kentucky. I turned in applications to every single one of them. Peerless in particular, and I'm good friends with those guys now, but I basically got to reply like, nope, the guys that we're hiring are the guys that built this place.
That is the story.
Yeah, so Copper Kings were the ones that called me back, either because, certainly not because I was the best person for the job, but I'm sure I was the cheapest person for the job at that time. So.
Copper Kings is a marvelous place. It's in Nulu or Butchertown,
right
in Louisville, close to downtown. Brian's been there, I've been there. We love to take friends there. It's such a surprising place. Also, huge array of products.
Yeah.
Very ambitious.
Absolutely.
So, some of that rub off in terms of your ambition?
Yeah, so I got to head up several. I've always had ambition and I've always had passion for this, right? Especially in my late 20s. But at Copper Kings in particular, I got to head up a few projects. Excuse me, the Absinthe project in particular. Especially the variations on absinthe, we were doing vapor distilled absinthe, so we did like lavender, we did a citrus, we did a ginger. That was kind of my baby, and then Butchertown brandy, which was, I don't know what it is now, I'm sure it's the same. It was a blend of three. Once used bourbon barrels and then one new American oak barrel brandy, blended together at 120 plus proof. So that was kind of my other baby there, and it was a good learning experience because, truthfully. So the people they hired as consultants, right? Joe and Leslie Heron, they had some background in the beverage industry, great in marketing, brilliant people as far as that goes. But when they hired me and they hired Brandon O'Daniel, the other distiller at the time, Brandon wasn't a distiller, he was a winemaker, right? Nobody else in the building had any distilling experience, and my distilling experience on a 150-gallon pot still in my backyard is a little bit different than here's a 1,000-gallon pot still and a 700-gallon pot still, and here's a boiler, and here's a cooling unit on the roof. Go figure it out. So it was good from a practical distillery experience sort of thing. You very quickly learn whose phone numbers you need to have in your phone to come fix things because I'm not a mechanic. So and there's also a little bit of like culture shock when you go from being on that side of things, being on the legal side of things, and being in the legal distillery, and all the little bells and whistles that go along with that.
So what year was this Copper King when you first started?
2014.
So that was the start of
13, 14, something like that.
the craft explosion. And at that time, there wasn't any classes that you could take on distillation like there is now.
Right. So Moonshine University was there, and they have their 5 and 6 day distillers course. It's a good course for people who want to get into the business, and they certainly put on some great classes at Moonshine University, especially on individual subjects. But the 5 or 6 day distillers course doesn't necessarily give you a whole lot of actual practical experience with distilling and fermentation and all that stuff. It's very kind of business oriented. There's really not to this day a lot of places to go learn this art unless you just go work for another distillery somewhere. I am a big defender of home distilling. One of the things that I've heard certain people in the industry say is that no distillery that's worth their salt would hire a home distiller, and I couldn't disagree with that more. I'd hire a home distiller over any guy coming out or gal coming out of any program in the United States right now because they're showing that they're passionate about it. It's not easy to do at home, and you're often working in circumstances that aren't real easy. So they're showing that they have the passion and they want to learn. I'll bring that person, as long as they don't have bad habits, I'll bring that person in a heartbeat on top of somebody who has necessarily worked somewhere else and picked up everybody else's bad habits, or picked up things that don't fit the profile of the spirit that I want to do. So yeah, there's not a whole lot of places to learn at. For sure.
So this is the Bourbon podcast, but you've been around brandy. Copper Kings is primarily a brandy distillery. So brandy is
migrated to
it does that. A couple of gins. So brandy is distilled wine. Is that correct?
Yep.
So if you make apple brandy, you start off by making apple wine and then you distill that.
Yeah, apple wine, or the other way it can be made is what are called mash brandies, and that's what was made here. We'll talk about later in the Black Forest region of southern Indiana. So mash brandies, instead of being wine, so instead of taking the apples, grinding them, pressing them, getting the juice and fermenting that to like a cider and then distilling it, what you're actually doing is you're taking the apples, grinding up the entire apple skin and all, and then you're putting that into a fermenter with hot water, cooking it with that hot limestone water until you're actually extracting all of the apple. So, but yes, generally it's a wine-based or fruit-based spirit for brandy, absolutely. And for sure that's where, and I love doing whiskey, I love doing bourbon, rye whiskey, single malt, all that stuff, but my passion really falls into apple brandy and absinthe as well. Those are really my two. The things that I like, right? They're not necessarily going to pay the light bill, but they're what I like to make.
So you're a Copper Kings local. How did you find your way to the spirits of French Lick in southern Indiana?
Well, so I should say this first and foremost. I am thankful to Joe and Leslie Herron that they hired me at Copper Kings. But I was pretty apparent. It was pretty apparent to me very early on that was not going to be like. I mean, you guys have been to Nulu, you've seen it, and you show up today like that's not my crowd. I don't fit in that crowd necessarily, right? Like I'm more of a. I like the idea of working in a rural distillery. I very much so like the idea of being on my side of the river, right? And being able to play off of that history in southern Indiana. And so what happened was I knew that it wasn't going to be a long-term home with Copper Kings. It was just the way into the industry. I had to find somewhere else I could go to, and part of that was waiting on Indiana to change their craft distilling laws. So I'd made a lot of friends before that, especially in my kind of moonshining days. Lisa Wicker, the Widow Jane, and Steve Beam out of Limestone Branch have become good friends with me, and they both encouraged me to get into this in the first place and help me get into Copper Kings. But at the same time, Indiana's starting to open up as far as the craft distilling thing goes, and I'm looking around trying to find something, and Lisa just happened to know the owners here at Doty's. The Doty family started the French Lick Winery, and she knew they were looking for a distiller. They asked her who she'd recommend. She recommended me. I think they also talked to Ted Cooper, and Ted recommended me. I believe they talked to Steve Beam and a couple others, and basically my name just kept coming up over and over again. And again, I knew that time the Copper Kings was going to be short, and I actually remember I was driving the box truck back from Mount Washington, Kentucky, full of Vidal grapes. Is going to do a Kentucky-only brandy once a year, and I was kind of going through my brain like I got to figure out where I'm going to go, what I'm going to do, how I want to handle this whole thing. And I got the phone call from John Doty, and he's like, "You don't have a meeting with us this weekend." And I think before he could offer me a job, I had already agreed to work here. So basically, and I made it very clear to him like what my caveats were. Like the thing in Copper Kings was it was never going to be a real reflection of who I am as far as with the spiritual. Joe and Leslie already had that plot down. That's fine. So I needed to be somewhere where I could actually use my talents to full effect as far as I was concerned. So I made it very clear when I met with John Doty, listen, just let me, come to these mash bills and kind of steer the ship a little bit as far as that goes, and we'll make this thing work. And there'll be times when it looks like it's not working. It'll get there. Just have to be patient.
A lot of that is your experimentation. I mean, you do a lot of things that big guys or other craft distillers don't do. You want to speak on that, like some of the different grains that you use, some of the distillation?
Absolutely. So I make the joke all the time. It's sort of a twofold joke. So the first part of the joke is that there's no such thing as Southern Indiana. It's Hoosier occupied Northern Kentucky, right? If you abbreviate that, it actually spells honky. Just throwing that out there. And the reason I say this is that the culture in Southern Indiana is typically a little different than it is in the rest of Indiana. If somebody from outside the state asks you where you're from Southern Indiana, you don't even know she do it. You don't say I'm from Indiana, you say I'm from Southern Indiana, right? Because it's almost its own separate sort of culture that's sort of unique and contained, and more probably in common with Northern Kentucky and Central Kentucky than maybe the rest of the state has. I forgot even where I was going with that. What was the question again? Just rambling now.
So the experimentation.
Experimentation and the alternate grades and all that stuff. So the second part of that is that it's the wrong side of the quote-unquote magic river, right? So people in Kentucky and certain people in Indiana think that like the distilleries all came to the southern bank of the Ohio River and they stood on the southern bank and they looked at the northern bank and they thought, I don't know what's over there, but I'm not going, right? And so if you're going to be only an hour away from Louisville and be in Bourbon's backyard, but on the wrong side of the river, you can't do the same things that they're doing because nobody's going to care. Like if we clone Old Forester, nobody's going to pay what we need to get out of it to make it happen. Yeah, exactly. For an Indiana, and that nowadays there's so many of them they've been doing it cloned in Kentucky, because who would care? So if you're going to get that attention and you're going to prove yourself as a legitimate force in the industry, you have to do things that are very different. Now that's easy for me because I come from that home distilling background, and part of that is my passion for playing with these different grains, etc. I already knew kind of what the mash bills would be because it was all stuff I played with before. But what's interesting is from the outside looking in, it all does look new, it all does look alternative. But if you go back into the history of distilling, especially bourbon, whether it's Indiana or Kentucky, and you go back to before industrialization, which is 1870. So if you were to drop into 1850, you have DeLorean, and you could drop into 1850. These things that we're doing here, they're not new, they're not different. These are things that farm distillers are doing, right? So the spectrum that we think of, we'll just stick to bourbon for a moment, what we think of as bourbon now is like this, right? And if you went back to pre-prohibition, before it went down to the 6 or 7 big guys, it was like this. If you went back to 1870, before industrialization, it was like this. So there's a lot of room to be able to play in that category of alternative grains. Just a few years ago, TPB finally said, you can use pseudo grains like amaranth, quinoa, buckwheat, etc. in bourbon. So that obviously opens some doors. Any of those grains can then be malted or roasted. So there's all kinds of opportunity for different unique flavor profiles, different yeast strains, etc. And that's the only way you're going to get anybody in the door. It's the only way you're going to get anybody paying attention. You got to make something that's good, that's relatable to what they know to some degree, right? It clearly, you drink it, it's bourbon, but it pushes the envelope as far as the palate goes, and it makes it interesting in what's happening.
So with all these new distilleries across the United States, has being distilled in Indiana, has that changed over the years since you've been here, where more people are receptive to trying it, not just this night because it's Indiana as opposed to Kentucky?
I think it's slowly changing, especially because I do a lot, to try to bring the history to the forefront of Southern Indiana, particularly as far as distilling goes. For the longest time in the industry, it was always, somebody sees distilled Indiana, maybe they're going to well, that must be buying their stuff from GD,
right.
Which, fair enough, a lot of people are doing that. But, we've certainly had, I think, enough interesting distilleries. And a few come to mind. Obviously, Ted Huber has done well. Hard Truth, they're finally putting out some of their own rye. Brian Smith is an excellent distiller. You've got Old 55, Jason Cruz doing the sweet corn bourbon thing, which is pretty unique. And then you've got us. There's obviously more than just that out there, but I think that those are some of the ones that are kind of drawing some attention and showing that there's more to Indiana than just what MGP does, even if they are the big guy. Now, it's changed in that people are actually seeking out particularly our stuff in Huber's, which I think is interesting, especially like on the limited releases. They'll go search for that stuff all day long, and you get people coming in, and they come from other states, and they mule bottles out for their friends, come and buy a few cases at a time, which I kind of enjoy. Further away they come from, the funnier I find it to me, but whatever, as long as they like it, they keep signing checks, I'm happy. So it has changed a little bit, but you do still, to some degree, there's still that bias of, it says distilled in Indiana, it probably came from WP. Even now being 7 years in, and having the accolades that we have, we still get a little bit of that, oh, you guys are probably just buying. No, we're not. We don't source anything from elsewhere. We did one time for wheated bourbon when we first started. We bought some whiskey from, can't say what distillery, but the state of Wyoming. It's probably pretty easy to figure out. And we blended 40% of that with 60% of our 2-year-old wheated bourbon. And that's the only source product that we've ever had out there. It's the only one we have built as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I heard a phrase one time on the radio show, Car Talk. We were talking about Cujo's.
Yeah.
And Ray McGreal made the comment, the French copy Bourbon and Bourbon copies the French. I think we turn that around and say Alan Bishop copies Bourbon and Bourbon copies Alan Bishop. What you're doing right here, the word unique is overdone, but you are doing some remarkable things. my introduction to some of your alternate grains was I picked up a bottle of Lee Sinclair, and I saw it was 4-grain bourbon. So it's like, what? It's going to be corn, it's going to be rye, it's going to be malted barley, and it's going to be corn. You know, it's going to be wheat. Erase wheat and put in oats. So tell us about oats as a grain for whiskey.
Absolutely. So the oats, and again, when I first came up with the oat thing, that was for sugar shy. I was 15 or whatever, and I kind of developed into that Lee Sinclair mash bill in my 20s. So at the time that I put them in there, I didn't know that oats had any history of distilling. But they have a very long history of distilling, especially in Indiana and Kentucky. So if you go back again to that magic date that I'm always talking about there, 1870 for industrialization, go back prior to that and you look at the agricultural census books for Indiana and Kentucky, you will find out that oats were the number 1 crop in both Indiana and Kentucky.
Wow.
And they were primarily being used for whiskey distillation.
Okay.
So they're a very old part of whiskey distillation. Prior to that, if you go back to the British Isles, you go back before Scotch whiskey and Irish whiskey existed, and you look at things like poachine, and I don't remember what the word was for the Scottish stuff, or aqua vitae, which is very early on. Oats are almost always a part of those mash bills, whether it's raw oats or as malted oats. And the reason for it is, in those early times, it's what they were commonly growing, right? You use what you have, what's in your local food shed. Your local distillery was always tied to your local food shed, and that's one of the beautiful things about craft distilling is we're tying ourselves back to local food shed and local watersheds and the small food, slow food movement. But the other reason that you're using oats is really because they're soft and they're sweet, and they distill exactly. They're one of the rare things that distills exactly like what you would think they distill like. They maintain their flavor profile and their characteristic. They have a very high fat content. They're very oily on the palate. They're very soft. They're very creamy. They have these interesting things, and I'm sure there's a technical word for this, and I don't know what it is, but I call them flavor roots. So where one flavor modifies another flavor, right? And it makes that flavor more interesting. So if you drop oats in with wheat, you're thinking sweet and sweet at the same time. Not necessarily. Those oats have that sweetness and that creaminess, and then they bring out some interesting, almost black pepper characteristics on the wheat of all things. They also bring out a little bit more of that sort of cereal characteristic from the wheat. You drop oats into, say, an absinthe, for example. You soften it up a little bit. You made it a little bit more creamy, a little bit more round. So that's very much so why I love distilled oats. And I think out of all the grains, oats are the closest thing to, as far as utility goes, the closest thing grain-wise to a fruit out of the grain groups. And I think that's what kind of attracted me to them.
So when you were 15 years old and you were trying oats, where did you get those oats?
They're Quaker oats.
So I'm fairly familiar with agriculture in Western Kentucky, Southern Illinois, Southern Indiana. To yellow corn, sure. Soybeans, sure. Winter wheat, maybe. But I don't know anybody around here growing oats today.
Amish. That's about it. That's about it. Ours come out of, once we buy for here, they come out of Kentucky. As a matter of fact, there's a little Amish mill down there. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but that's the only place I can find that. And that amount of quality and quantity. And then Sugar Creek Malting up in Lebanon, Indiana. Can't call it oats as well.
You've done some work with heirloom corn?
Absolutely, yes.
In fact, I think you grow some of your own corn.
I do. So we actually created our own heirloom corn. I created my own heirloom corn. Not heirloom, it's not the heirloom yet, but it's based on the same premise. So it's a Lander's variety, that's what it is. So we basically took, every time there was and this is goofy plant breeding stuff, I don't know why I even started, but every time a diaspora left Mexico, we tried to find some version of that genetically and fold that back into sort of the Midwest dent corn populations. Dent corn being like the yellow number 2, you see it can be whatever color, it's just the morphology of the kernel itself. And then start selecting that on average of what did best on the farm year over year, what had the best flavor in grits and the best flavor in cornmeal, and then subsequently the best flavor in whiskey. And then after a year or two, that went to, now we're just selecting a corn specifically whiskey. And what are the best properties of those corns that can make the best possible whiskey. And what I learned in that process was all those different colors, because this corn is called Amanda Palmer. I didn't name things after people that inspire me. Amanda Palmer's lead singer of the Dresden Dolls band. So what we tended to find was each of these different individual colors of corn, they're all related to amino acids. Hot still distillation is all about retention and concentration of flavor through heating over time in a batch system. And each of those amino acids is either water soluble or fat soluble. So the precursors, the aromatic precursors of each of those individual colors comes across during distillation, right? And so you suddenly start to realize that a corn made with, or a whiskey made with blue corn tastes different from whiskey made with white corn, tastes different from whiskey made with orange corn, red corn, etc., because those are the amino acids. And then it becomes, well, let's have a multicolored corn. And let's figure out what the proper proportion of those colors is to make the type of whiskey that we want. This literally has become like a 15 or 16 year thing at this point. So I got on over here and they wanted to do an heirloom corn. I'm like, well, you guys have a farm and I've got seed, so here you go. Not only do an heirloom corn, we do our heirloom.
See, this is one of the beauties of craft distilleries. It's each one just has its own story, its own background. Few of them are as singular as Spirits of French Lick. I know you love history. A lot of your products are named for real IP.
Absolutely.
Lee W. Sinclair, who is he?
So Sinclair was a local businessman. He was the son of a prominent textile mill owner from Chicago. Later on they moved to Greene County, Indiana, and then Sinclair himself ended up in Washington County when he got married, Washington County being right next door to where we are now. Washington County is where I'm from. So Sinclair was a direct descendant of the Scottish Sinclairs. So there's a little Rosicrucian sort of fun stuff going on there, a little occultism and all that stuff, but he basically hooks up with a local businessman in Washington County named John A. Bowman. And Bowman was a banker. Bowman kind of got Lee into politics because he'd been a state representative, state senator, etc. He also got Lee into banking himself, and when Bowman died, he actually more or less gave his shares of the New Albany and Salem state banks to Lee Sinclair. He took those over. The railroad, has been in this region since 1852, 1853, and in this region where we're at now, in Springs Valley, which is West Maiden and French Lick, it's always been a little bit of a resort town because of the unique minerals in the water. So there was a old hotel where the Dome now exists out here in town that was called the Maiden Lick Hotel. He came in and he bought that. He also bought a share in the bank here as well because you're doing business in town. You might as well own part of the bank, I suppose. So he ran that for a couple of years. It burned down, and he was going to get completely out of the business, right? But the one thing that Lee loved more than money or business or the occult was his daughter. And his daughter Lillian had fallen in love with the business. And she convinced him to rebuild, and he decided if he was going to rebuild, he was going to make it the Carlsbad of America. And Lee traveled all over Europe for several years, especially sort of exploring those Templar and Rosicrucian sort of background things. He'd seen a lot of really interesting places, a lot of really neat architecture, and he decided he wanted to build the West Maiden Dome here in town. It was the largest freestanding dome in the world for a very long time. Every engineer he went to told him that it was impossible to do, and he basically found a 27-year-old kid who never really actually built anything. He was able to pull it off, and he made it into this wonderful sort of world-class resort with what he called a gaming room, which is really just a casino with a different name, and that sort of kind of started building this valley up as sort of a resort casino sort of area. So, we know Lee Sinclair certainly would have liked whiskey and been very familiar with whiskey. We are in basically his town. I'm also from his county. There's too many connections not to make the tribute. We're right across from the Dome Hotel. We're on Sinclair Street. So I've heard enough ghost stories about Lee Sinclair in my life that I figured it made sense to put his name on the bottle. So, and then make sure that he actually got a couple bottles of it. So we take the first 3 bottles that we make of everything that's named after somebody, and we go to either that person's grave, the historic location, a descendant, or someone who plays that character to reenact it. So Sinclair does have a mausoleum in Salem, Indiana that has bottle number 1 of both the 2-year and the 4-year in it, because I don't need to be staying in my bed.
So if you take a detour off the Kentucky Bourbon Trail to come to French Lick, and you should, you owe it to yourself to stay in one of the 2 resort hotels. West Maiden Springs is within walking distance, right across the street. It's an amazing place. It once was in ruins. It was abandoned. It's been restored beautifully. My wife and I stayed there during Christmas last year. Or the French Lick Resort, another historic hotel. It has an adjacent casino if that's something that interests you. But spend a night here and stay in one of these amazing hotels.
And of course, come see Alan. The amazing spirits, and also the wine that you guys do is also very amazing.
See me, I'll tell you ghost stories.
Well, we should mention Spirits of French Lake is on the same property, the same building as the French Lake Winery.
Yep.
And so if you do a tour here and you do a tasting, when you get up to the tasting table, you can have a choice of trying either spirits or wines or a combination thereof. So you got probably 50 different things that you can try. Maybe you need to spend a couple of nights here.
Slushies and cocktails, we got all that stuff too, right? There's no rule that says you can't blend spirits and wine together either, so just, whatever fits
Not in our world.
That's right. That's right.
You also have a product named Maddie Gladden.
Yes.
Tell us about this. It's a aristocratic lady, I'm sure.
It's an interesting character.
Yeah, so most of the spirits, so the reason we name bottles after those spirits is because being a historian, like I can write most in the paper in the world about any of these characters, right? 5 people are going to read it, right? Nobody really cares. Nobody's going to read, 5, 6, 7 pages, catch up on all this stuff. But you put their face on a bottle and you put a little blurb about them on the back of the bottle, and it works in such a way that it makes you feel something about that bottle, and you have an emotion attached to it. And now, really, I joke that it's a form of necromancy. Like these names are names that would have, like, nobody knew Lee Sinclair or Maddie Gladden in New Orleans. Now they do, right? Now people talk about it again. Nobody really knew Maddie Gladden in Salem because it's kind of a scandalous story, and so I got married. So Maddie Gladden was, she started off as Maddie Gladden. I'm trying to remember her original name now. I'm sorry, I missed that. Anyways, long and short, she worked for Lee Sinclair as a teenager, as a housekeeper. Martha Jane Johnson, that was her. Took me a minute to get there. And at some point in time, she met up with a gentleman at Sinclair's house who was a business associate of Sinclair's, and they fell in love. It was obviously a very inappropriate relationship. And the rumor is that Lee basically ran the guy out of town and moved with him. So she disappears for a few years. We don't know what happened to her first husband. He either divorced her, or she divorced him, or he died. We can't find him in history. He just disappears. She's married again. At that time, all these rumors are sort of circulating in southern Indiana because she still has a lot of family around Salem, Indiana, that she has become the prominent madam of 2 different brothels, one in Chattanooga and one in Nashville. Which you can imagine how that played out for the family in Salem, I'm sure, having to hear about that all the time. Shortly thereafter, that she had a child from her first marriage who had a disease called Bright's disease, which is kind of a degenerative disease. And so she decided she was going to get out of that line of business and she was going to move back to Salem. Again, this is not something that is entirely provable, but the working theory and the working rumor was that she was sort of a prominent lover of P.T. Barnum, of certain speaking. When she decided she was going to get out of the business, P.T. Barnum gave her a parting gift. Who knows how much money that was, but she decided to move back to Salem, Indiana. When she comes to Salem, she's married to a man named Percy Gladden. They have a very volatile relationship. Percy Gladden was from New York. He started several theaters throughout his lifetime, owned all kinds of different businesses. A little bit of a drunkard and a little bit of a big mouth, for sure. So Maddie comes back to Salem, and she buys a lot in Salem, and she's having this giant Victorian house built, right? Big, huge, 3-story, beautiful Victorian-style house. Of course, everybody immediately starts, well, she's going to turn that into a whorehouse, right? She denies it all the way up until she moves into it when she turns it into a brothel. But she was very smart about the way she handled this. So it's on Main Street in Salem, which is funny because Salem's a very small railroad town at the time, very conservative, still pretty conservative to this day. She wasn't marketing for local people. Not to say that she didn't take in local people, but it was railroad town. She's marketing the guys moving back and forth between Chicago and Nashville. And every day she'd walk down to the train station and she had business cards. She was literally dressed to the nines. She'd wear a black dress, pearl necklace, big fascinator hat, and all that stuff. As a matter of fact, we got a story from one of her neighbors that remembered her from when she was a little girl, and she told the story of 3 o'clock in the afternoon every day, and the parents would leave the kids in the house because they wanted to see Maddie, right? She said, I stayed outside one time and hid outside behind some bushes when she was a little girl, and she said, I was watching for her to walk by, and she explained she had on the dress and everything, and as Maddie walked by the little girl and was so stunned she stood up, and her jaw was open, just aghast at seeing this woman that she'd never seen like this before, and Maddie walked over and sort of like patted her on the head and said, "More of you, do your thing." About that time, my mother saw this happen. He runs over, grabs the little girl, and takes her inside. And go to bed. You're not getting supper tonight, any of that stuff. It's apparently it's a sin to see a woman like that walk down the street or something. I don't know. The long and short of it, she basically run this brothel in Salem because there were no laws that said she couldn't do it. So every year they were trying to introduce some new law that was sort of restricted a little bit more what she was doing. She very much so was in charge of the brothel. She had 3 girls that worked for her, and the 3 girls that worked for her, they all had to be educated. So the 3 girls that we know that did work for her went to the Cosi Academy in Salem, Indiana, which was called the Athens of the West at the time. They all had to be able to play harpsichord because although things might end physically every night, it's also a house of entertainment. It's not just a place where you go for that. It's a place where you're going to go and you're going to have food and you're going to drink and you're going to, you want that kind of entertainment sort of atmosphere, right? Kind of a burlesque sort of aspect to it for sure. So with Maddie and Percy Gladden, they end up, obviously, like I said, had a very volatile relationship. They get divorced. A year later, Percy comes into town from Chicago and he's drunk. He gets off the train and he goes to Maddie's house and tries to break into her house. She warns him, and when he doesn't stop, she shoots a .38 caliber pistol from the window of the bathroom. And actually, you can see where she actually hit the window if you're in the bathroom with the bullet, which probably saved his life. And the bullet lodges in his left cheek. They end up taking him to Louisville to the hospital. He lives through it. She must have had something very special going on because a year later they were married again. So there's that. She had a really sad story at the end, though. She was married one last time after Percy. Ironically, Percy went on to marry another woman named Maddie in Orleans, Indiana. So there are 2 Maddie Gladdens in southern Indiana. But the last gentleman she married was a local farmer, and they both had prenups on them. So there must have been something there, right? Because he wasn't after her money, she wasn't after his money. Her son dies, and then less than a year later, she dies. She also had Bright's disease. So the last few years, she wasn't really running a brothel. When they finally did close the brothel down after 6 or 7 years, she actually brought these 2 new Grecian statues and she put them in the front parlor window because, in her words, how could these sophisticated women of Salem complain about parties? And she also had a little bit of a heads up on everybody too because she just happened to have the nicest carriage and the nicest horse team in town. So every time there was a parade for the 4th of July or Centennial, they went to Maddie to get her buggy, to have that buggy carry the keynote speaker at the time. And she would make a big deal of having one of her ladies with her. There's one picture of it's very blurry, but it's her sitting next to one of the ladies with a parasol over top of her big wagon, big black stallion horses. So yeah, it's a really, really cool story. And the other thing I want to point out, so she has bottle number 1 at her grave. She has ironically took a little water from her grave. She's buried in Crown Hill Cemetery. But the name is on the back side of the marker instead of the front side, and I still don't know the connection. She's buried next to her son and 2 other people, but ironically, it is a Kennedy family plot, but not that Kennedy family. But there's still some irony. A little bit of a, you get it. A little nudge there, so.
So one of the fun things about coming to Spirits of French Lake is to explore the gift shop because there are so many surprises. I want to ask you that too. One of them, you have an absinthe, which a lot of people have a lot of misconception about.
Right.
But you have an absinthe that has been aged for 2 years in a used bourbon barrel?
New oak barrel.
New oak barrel, okay. Yeah. But it's brown liquid.
It is, absolutely, yeah.
It's giving that color to that barrel?
Yeah. It's a charred new oak barrel, same as the newer bourbon.
I got you, okay.
Yeah, number two charred oak.
Okay.
So how long is it sit in the barrel after?
That one was 2 years. I think I've got one back there now that's like 3 or 4 years, something like that. So, yeah,
Does that take that black licorice taste away?
it makes it more subtle. So it sort of brings everything down and mellows it out just a little bit. So that was the idea of it was. So the 2 worst crowds of fans in the world are bourbon snobs and absinthe snobs. And even though there are far less absinthe snobs than there are bourbon snobs, I will tell you that absinthe snobs are 10 times worse than the worst bourbon snob you will ever meet. They're the worst people on the face of the planet. I have no problem saying that. They're just terrible people, terrible humans. But bourbon drinkers and absinthe drinkers, they don't go back and forth, right? You're not going to get a bourbon guy to go after absinthe. You're not going to get an absinthe guy to go after bourbon. So how do you sort of bridge that gap and also bridge that sort of sacred profane, bringing those two worlds together? And that's how we did it. So we just basically take our absinthe, we proof it down, go into a new oak barrel, that brings some of that bourbon tonality into it, so that maybe a bourbon drinker can appreciate it a little bit more. As far as the absinthe goes, and then maybe the absinthe drinker can kind of appreciate some of those oak notes from bourbon a little bit more when they drink it. And the idea was to make it sort of a dessert absinthe, a dessert whiskey alternative, basically a digestive sort of thing. So we did it at a lower proof. I think it's at 106 proof, something like that. And the idea that you would sit down after dinner, instead of having dessert, you might drink a glass of this and find something that you enjoy there. Maybe figure out that you actually like absinthe, but you just didn't know it. Or figure out that you like bourbon, you just didn't know it. So that was really the goal. And then we amethyst filtered it, and that was legitimately, basically, as kind of a joke. So Dan Aykroyd does the Crystal Skull vodka thing, and I love Dan Aykroyd, and I love Ghostbusters. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to run absinthe through amethyst because it just sounds full of shit enough. And it'll be more good.
You also have a product in there, a white bourbon whiskey. Now, by definition, by law, a bourbon must be aged in a new charred oak vessel.
Right?
So, apparently that white bourbon has been in a new charred oak vessel.
Has been. Yep.
How long?
Not long. So
It's clear.
So this whole white bourbon whiskey thing, we don't do it anymore. We did that starting off, and really that was one of those. You can get people to talk about you initially, right? Whether it's positive or negative, they're at least talking about you, and they'll come back around if you can prove them wrong. So instead of doing a moonshine, which is a hard sell in Southern Indiana a lot of times, we thought that white bourbon whiskey was just sacrilegious enough that it would be worthwhile. So what we did is we would literally get new oak barrels in, and I would take the heads out the very top of them, and roll those directly underneath the still. And I think it was 3 barrels at a time, something like that. And we would collect the distillate as it ran off the still. And as soon as that barrel was full, I'd pump it out and pump it over into another container. So it was literally like, parts of it were probably sitting there for 15 minutes, but other parts of it were like 30 seconds, as little time as possible because it made it that much fun as far as I was concerned.
Then you reuse that for, I guess, rye whiskey?
Yeah, we reuse it for something else. It was very expensive.
Yeah.
It was also incredibly stupid because all it did was make people mad. It was good. It was actually pretty decent whiskey, but it pissed people off too much.
So how do you get people to talk about it?
Got Fred Minnick to talk about this when they want to do it. Oh, yeah.
Speaking of which, Alan does a lot of interesting things, quirky things, sacrilegious things in spirits and French whip, but he's also making award-winning spirits. Fred Minnick, you mentioned him. They just had the 2022 Ascot Awards, and the Lee W. Sinclair won a platinum.
Yeah.
You've won multiple awards at Ascot for multiple years.
Yeah.
So he's great stories behind his products, but these are quality products that are winning awards. They're worth drinking. It's worth visiting.
Absolutely, yeah. And we love having people come through and doing the tours and telling the stories and all that kind of stuff. It's obviously something that we're passionate about. We've won a lot of awards on several different things, which is always a lot of fun, but it's more fun for me when you hear from people who actually drink our products, how much they enjoy, right? And the best ones are the ones that are like, I didn't think that I would like to give you, but I do. Or the ones that are not, I tried this whiskey the first time, and it's so out of the normal range that I didn't like it. But then I came back to it, I tried it again, and now I love it. And that's what's fun about it. Certainly, Minnick he has pressed the gas pedal course a couple of times, for sure. I mean, we won that platinum this year at the Ascot Award. I think we won platinum on it last year. And then in his Whiskey of the Year thing, not this past year, the year before, he called it it was the best bourbon made outside of Kentucky, and it finished in the top 6.
That's very cool.
It's amazing how much volume that moves very quickly. I mean, it's literally overnight we were sold out. We have a very hard time keeping up still to this day. Now the fun thing though is Minnick loves Lee Sinclair, right? He doesn't like Maddie Gladden. We sell as much Maddie Gladden as we do Lee Sinclair, so different strokes for different balls, I think. So.
Do you consider Lee Sinclair your signature bourbon?
Yes, that's definitely our flagship as far as I'm concerned.
You've got a single barrel and a bottle of malt.
Yep, and then we've done, we also do this thing every year where I'll take, typically every year, not every year, every few years, there's always a few barrels that are outliers, right? They're not bad, but they're way off profile, right? And they might be way off profile in such a direction that now they're going forward. They're interesting, but they're not really single barrel material. So what we do is we hold those back. And they don't have to be the same season. But usually we like to do at least 3 barrels. And we'll blend those and we can come up with a really good, interesting blend, especially with these very unique, one-off versions of wheat where there might be a huge cinnamon note on it. It's not on any of the other wheats. Or there might be a little bit more tannic note or a little bit more black pepper. We'll save those 3 barrels, we'll figure out a blend, and we blend them together and call that the Iconic series. And it just gets released through the tasting room. And it's at cask strength, and it's just another version that's very, very differentiated of each of the mainline products. So we'll do that with all of them that we have. We've got the Solomon Rye whiskey that we'll release as bottled and bond this fall. We've actually got a couple of Iconic barrels set aside that had these weird, I think barbecue potato chip. This is the best way to say it. Okay. And I thought, well, how can you ramp that up even more? So we put some Andrew on it. Let's see what that means.
So walking around the tasting room before we did, there was bourbon treatment. Actually, I think it was Bourbon.
Right, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I should have asked if I could even cuss on your podcast earlier. I was trying to avoid it. I got one in there anyways. So, food bar obviously means what you think it means. Especially if you've ever seen Tango and Cash, or as I like to call it, the Expendables group. That's really what it was.
Also taking private wine.
Yes, yeah, exactly. What that was, we had a still end at the time. He wasn't real apt to pay attention to what was going on.
That's why it happened. Over here, right?
Yes, basically. By his own volition. He made the decision for us, I would say that. So we were working on rye whiskey at the time, and I am not a 95.5 fan. I know why people like it, I get it, but it always goes one of 2 directions for me. Especially with MGP, it's either dill, or it's like black cherry and it becomes like Roman custard. I can't do it. But the owner at the time wanted to play around with doing some 100% rye whiskey, and I thought, well, if we're going to do something in that nature, then let's play around with some different malts. And let's get some different rye malts. We'll also do some 95.5, play around with some different roasted malts.
95.5, 95% rye,
Yeah,
5% malt.
Yep. So, and then also we'll do some 95.5 with some malted rye as well. Several varieties of malted rye. Long and short of it is, that whole day was like the worst day on the face of the planet. I don't know what all went wrong, what he did do, what he didn't do. I know that he didn't put any enzyme in that particular mash bill, and if you don't use enzymes on 95.5, everything stuck up and it was like dough, right? And it was a nightmare to get that fixed. So I got that fixed finally, and we're running around doing other things, and he puts the malt in, but he grabs the wrong bags of malt. He grabs 2 different kinds of malt. Well, he knew he messed up. He threw the bags to him. And then he doesn't bother to tell me until the next day, like, oh yeah, I put the wrong malt in there. And I'm like, well, that's great. Like, I can't keep track of any of this now, and who knows what it's going to do. And I thought, well, it's going to be trash. So we ran it off on the still. It came off really good on the still. I thought, well, at least it's interesting, right? It's what the barrel still does. The long and short of it is we can't reproduce it. There's no way to ever reproduce it. I don't know what it is. I have no idea what it is. We probably had 5 or 6 varieties of rye malt sitting around here at the time, and probably 5 or 6 varieties of barley malt sitting around here at the time. And if he messed that up, who knows how much rye he actually put in it? I don't know. I have no idea what the percentage is. So yeah, we marked the barrels food bar because it seemed to make sense, and we put it on label. So I think there's still 2 or 3 barrels of that stuff left hanging out back there. Let's see what it does.
I want to ask you about one other thing. I read once where you were talking about letting bourbon breathe for 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
Yeah, so I'll give you a little background on that too. So it's all about making sure that some of those more volatile elements come off when you're drinking. This actually applies to also when you're getting ready to bottle as well. So one of the things that we do, so we don't do any chill filtration or anything. I can move down very slowly, which is a whole different story. But what we go into is, and I don't know if the people watching can see, but we've got the stainless states back here. Those are blending things. They're beer fermenters we use them for blending. And the reason we use those is because you can open up the atmosphere and it'll capture the air in there. So we try to blow off a lot of that volatility as we're proofing. Get rid of some of that, the whole ethanol forward sort of stuff. or some of the elements are rye that you might not want, they're a little more heavy and vegetative. But the same thing is true. Whenever you put whiskey through a bottle of wine, it goes through a bottle shop, the same way the wine is. So after we bottle that whiskey, we like to sit on it in a cage for at least 2 weeks. But even after that, when you first open that whiskey up and you pour that glass of whiskey, it needs to set for a minute, especially with pot still whiskey, because you're holding on to so much more of that flavor. Flavor being positive or negative, right? It needs a little time for the air to get to it, and some of those heavier elements to sort of come off of it. If you pour a glass of it immediately, if you pop the bottle, pour a glass of it immediately, you put it up your nose, especially if it's a brand new bottle, first thing you're getting off of any whiskey, I don't care what it is, you're getting that from because it hasn't had time to sort of relax and calm down and come back around. And that's the mistake that people make with pot still whiskey. Pot still whiskey, I have a hashtag I use all the time. It's pot still funk, right? It's pot still whiskey is funk. It's different. People are used to very industrialized column still stuff. So pot still whiskey definitely needs more time to open up the balance. And you have to be able to slow down enough to enjoy it too.
So you recommend 5 minutes, 15 minutes?
I think the longer the better. Truthfully, you can pour it walk away for 5 or 10 minutes. And then when I do that, I'll obviously leave the bottle open. You know, the can. Let it sit there. If I'm going to drink a bunch, right? I'm going to sit down after 3 or 4 glasses. Or is it going to pour it back in the bottle? Let it sit there. So, yeah.
Right, anything else?
Awesome.
It has been a gas to be here. Spirits of French Lick, Southern Indiana. Amazing place. Products you're not going to find anywhere else. Crazy stories. Quality product. Make a visit.
Thanks for having us out.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming, guys. I appreciate it greatly.
Yeah.
Come back anytime.